And welcome into a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We, as we have been doing so over the last couple of weeks, continue to track very busy details out of the North Carolina General Assembly. Dozens of committee meetings taking place over the last couple of weeks. And we've got an update this morning on a story we covered earlier in the week dealing with a bill out of the North Carolina Senate to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion in K through 12 schools. The details this morning is that bill did move through a committee on Wednesday to eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts in K through 12 public education. The piece of legislation, Senate Bill 227, was filed by Republican State Senate Leader Phil Berger, State Senator Michael Lee, and State Senator Brad Overcash, and it aims to remove DEI offices, staff, and divisive concepts from schools, ensuring education focuses on core curriculum without promoting ideologies deemed inconsistent with equality. The legislation outlines 12 divisive concepts, such as the belief that one race or sex is inherently superior to one another, and the idea that meritocracy is inherently racist or sexist, and a belief that the United States was founded to oppress certain groups of individuals. State Senator Michael Lee said during the committee meeting on Wednesday, quote, "There's nothing wrong with diversity. There's nothing wrong with equity. There's certainly nothing wrong with inclusion. I think the goals of DEI are good. But that's not what's been going on in practice. Unfortunately, a lot of these policies haven't really opened doors for people to compete fairly, but have focused artificially on outcomes at the expense of fairness and competency." Democrats on the committee raised concerns about the implications of the bill. Senator Woodson Bradley out of Mecklenburg County said, quote, "What I don't see is the specific carve-out for who gets to adjudicate this. Is this going to be up to educators and families? What are we talking about? Because people are going to have a perspective that we are going straight down the path to politicizing public education." DEI has been in the news a lot over the last couple of months, and it is making news here in North Carolina this morning. You can read more details on this story by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. You have heard the word tariff used a lot over the last few weeks. Even earlier this week, the Trump administration imposing a 25% tariff on some steel imports into the United States. To get some more details on that and talk about this discussion in a more overarching fashion, it's my pleasure to welcome the CEO of the John Locke Foundation, Bryson, to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning. Donald, thanks for the time. You've got a new opinion piece up over at carolinajournal.com talking about tariffs. Can you walk us through that this morning?
Sure. And thanks for having me on, Nick. I'm very excited to be on. It's always a good crowd to talk to. The President Trump, as you mentioned, announced 25% across the board tariffs on aluminum steel that would be imported. And comes after, weeks of threatening tariffs to China, Canada, and Mexico, and that sort of thing. Let's talk about what a tariff is real quick. A tariff is an arbitrary tax set by the government on goods that come into, or goods or commodities that come into the United States. So whatever the cost is, you add another percentage, in the case of aluminum steel, 25% onto what that is. I'm an open trade guy. I think that when there are no tariffs, that is probably the best. That means that there is just free and open exchange between customers and consumers and producers and that sort of thing, and that's great. And there probably is a place for tariffs. I signed the Freedom Conservatism Statement of Principles a couple of years ago, and that Statement of Principles on trade says that free people ought to be able to trade with free people. And I agree with that. So, for example, perhaps there are some trade barriers with China, unfree people, but perhaps we have free trade with Britain, free people. And I think that that's all fine. What I get a little lost on, and this is what the piece is about, is when people start talking about the trade deficit and how the trade deficit is awful and how we import more from China and Japan or Canada and Mexico, and that's awful. But when you really think through it, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Think about that you go to the grocery store. I go to Lowe's Foods. It's a North Carolina-based supermarket based out of Winston-Salem. I buy my groceries from them, and they buy nothing from me, absolutely nothing. Therefore, Lowe's Foods and I have a trade deficit.
Big one.
But nobody seems to think that that's a problem at all. It's because we have both derived value from the transaction, and that's the way international trade works.
It's interesting, and you'll hear not only will they be these discussions and conversations about trade not necessarily being freer or trade deficit, but you'll say, well, we're trying to make up various things. These countries owe us a certain amount of dollars, or there's all of these other issues economically going on. So the way in which we're going to recoup some of those costs is by putting a tariff in place. Donald, I've seen a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks on this. Are you of the mindset that the tariff directly impacts the American consumer in the long run in regards to the products and services that we buy and use?
I am. It does absolutely impact the American consumer because, let's be honest, corporations don't really pay taxes. They end up paying the tax bill, but whether it's a corporate income tax or a capital stock tax, like we have here in North Carolina, or if it's going to be a tariff on goods, they pass that along either in the form of increased costs for their goods and services or in the form of lower wages for their workers. And so we're going to pay this tariff, which is a tax, one way or the other. And again, not to say that there's not a place for them in sort of a negotiating position, but to go out and proactively say we are pro-tariff and tariffs are the economic policy of the United States across the board doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I was more on board when in his first term, and he's not talked about this as much, in his first term, President Trump, who I feel like does four good things for every one thing I'm irritated about. But he talked about how he would use tariffs to basically control national security situations. And so, like the way that we import rare earth metals from China, as an example, China is potentially adversarial. We're not really sure of their intentions. And so tariffs on goods coming in from China potentially could make sense as a negotiating point. I struggle to figure out what the national security problem is with Canada, right? Like, what's the terror threat there? Are the Canadians going to invade? I don't know what it is. What's up? What's wrong with Japanese steel? What's wrong with? I mean, he was going to impose, and then Joe Biden upheld those that they were going to put an additional tariff on French wine and cognac. Like, what threat does France pose to national security? I'm a little lost there. Now, President Trump has talked about increasing tariffs, which are taxes, to make up revenue for income tax cuts that he wants to do. And that is an interesting way to think about how do we finance the federal government. And it's honestly the way that the federal government paid for itself mostly for the first 100 years or so, or most of the first 100 years. We had tariffs on things. We didn't have an income tax. But the administrative state and the welfare state have exploded. We didn't have Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security when tariffs were doing all that. And so it's difficult to see if that's even possible. And honestly, it's the role of Congress to do and not the president.
We'll continue the conversation with the CEO of the John Locke Foundation, Donald Bryson, coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good Friday morning to you. Keeping our discussion this morning on the General Assembly, they have introduced the Cooper Accountability Act. We talked about this last week, House Bill 222, and it aims at closing out the remaining disaster recovery operations for Hurricanes Matthew and Florence that affected a good chunk of the eastern half of North Carolina. The bill allocates $217 million from the State Emergency Response and Disaster Relief Fund to the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, NCORR, of that organization of which we have spoken a lot in the past couple of months on. Earlier this week, the proposal passed the Judiciary 1 Committee. That happened Tuesday afternoon and now heads to the Appropriations and Rules Committee. During the presentation in front of the Judiciary Committee, Representative Brandon Jones, who is in Columbus County, which was one of the communities heavily affected by both Hurricanes Matthew and Florence, said, quote, "Today we're presenting to you the closing out of the operations and providing emergency relief bill, aka Cooper bill, to you. This is no surprise. We've been dealing with this for many years. I will not bore you with everything in here, but the highlights are this. Governor Stein came and he is asking for $217 million. He has guaranteed us that this will finish the project. He continued by saying, we have put a lot of accountability in here because the previous administration, well, honestly, we couldn't trust them. Money is missing and we're not going through that again. So this time we're going to be holding them accountable. We've got plenty of safeguards in here. We're going to wrap this up and we're going to make the people of Eastern North Carolina whole again. And we're ready to move forward with helping the governor wrap this up. This is obviously something that has been a large topic of discussion for many years now across the state, and it got a renewed interest after Hurricane Helene affected the western half of North Carolina. We'll keep an eye on NCORR and Grow NC, the group that is responsible for the Western recovery, right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. You can read more details on our website this morning at carolinajournal.com. We're talking tariffs this morning with the CEO of the John Locke Foundation, Bryson. Donald, I heard you say that you're using it as a negotiation tactic, using it as kind of a bargaining chip. There is some benefit to that, and maybe we've seen some of that in the first administration and maybe a little bit now. But overall, as we're looking at the word that Trump loves to use, tariff, as we were talking before the interview, he's mentioned it's one of his favorite words in the dictionary. Long term, where does something like this put the United States if we've got these massive tariffs on countries all throughout the world, and even some of our neighbors, like you were noting, Mexico and Canada?
Well, I mean, it puts us honestly paying for higher costs for goods in the long term. What you get are sort of these populist protectionists. Democrats and Republicans do this economically, where what they want is to put tariffs to slow down the flow of foreign imports into the United States so that people will buy American, right? And what they want are these high-paying union jobs. But high-paying union jobs and low-cost goods are not a thing. That's not a real thing. You can either have high-paying union jobs with high-cost goods, or you can have open trade or free trade, or whatever you want to call it, and have lower-cost goods. But you can't, like, the union jobs are going to cost you more money, and that's why they do. Cheap labor in China and Japan and Canada and Mexico are why we import goods from there, because they're just cheaper to make there and then bring them here. And so this sort of clamoring that some Republicans in Washington are doing to get, curry favor with the unions and the Rust Belt and that sort of thing, that's going to end up costing us more in our clothes and our cars and our appliances and those sorts of things.
Can you elaborate more a little bit on that in regards to the discussion that, well, if we put these tariffs in place, we will bring more manufacturing back to the United States? That was something that you were just mentioning. The Trump administration attempted to do that with steel in the first administration. There ended up being a huge net deficit in jobs due to the huge increase in the prices. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Again, it sounds good on paper, Donald. It makes sense. It's more expensive. We'll make it here. But does that actually shake out in reality?
It doesn't shake out in reality because we have the labor unions have an immense amount of political power here in the United States. And so, yes, we could bring some manufacturing back to the United States so that the companies don't have the import, they don't have the tariff costs, right, to move it across borders. But when they get here, they are paying far more for labor than they would in other countries because unions are demanding higher wages and they're demanding all of these benefits and they're demanding so much time off. And so the production costs or in terms of labor are just so much higher than they are in other countries for those businesses. And so the costs are going to go up one way or the other. And people think that, we should make things here. Well, yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with manufacturing. I think manufacturing is a good thing. But the American economy is so vast and so large that we just can't possibly make everything that we consume. And then there are the geographic limitations to some commodities, right? In the piece that I write, and people can find that at carolinajournal.com, root beer is a very simple thing, right? I've had, you go to the pharmacy and you get the root beer and all that, but you can't make that here. We can't, geographically, we are not situated to grow vanilla or wintergreen or several other ingredients in there. Same thing goes for rubber that goes into tires for our automotive sector. We just can't make that stuff here, and we have to import it. And so at some point, we have to figure out how to deal with trade But what happens when we decide that, Indonesia, with all the rubber trees, or Vietnam, decides that, those need to be tariffed as well? Well, then the cost of your car and the cost of replacing tires on your car goes through the roof.
One of the big reasons in which the president was elected, of course, was some of the higher prices that American consumers had seen over the last couple of years. Still kind of up in the air how some of that stuff is going to move down in the near-term future. Donald, this discussion about tariffs, do you think this is something early on that we're seeing maybe a short fuse being lit and this won't linger through the administration? Or do you think this is something that the president's likely to keep coming back to over the next 4 years?
Well, Donald Trump has he's very artful in that you can never tell what he's serious about and what he's unserious about. And the tariff threat to Mexico just a couple of weeks ago is a great example. He threatened a tariff under the scope of national security on, we don't know who's coming across the border, and drugs are coming across the border. And I actually think he's right on that issue. He threatened a tariff, and then Mexico conceded and said, yep, you're right, we're going to send military to the border, and we're going to help you police our side of the border, and you police your side of the border, and that will be great. And then then Trump suspended that idea. That sort of negotiation makes sense. But this across the board, and so across the board tariff on aluminum and steel, one, that's a major part of the economy because steel and aluminum are in everything. And it's not country specific. It's just wherever it's coming from in the world coming in here. And so I think a lot of his tariff threats are just that, they are threats. But then he is actually serious about utilizing tariffs as a way to drive government revenue and drive job creation in America.
Donald, appreciate the analysis this morning. You can read his piece by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. The John Locke Foundation CEO Donald Bryson joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Good morning again, and welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We've got some lighthearted news this morning out of the North Carolina General Assembly. The House Committee on State and Local Governments earlier this week advanced 2 bills that would create an official state cookie and star for North Carolina. House Bill 124 would elevate the Moravian cookie to the status of the official state cookie, and House Bill 125 would designate the Moravian star as North Carolina's official star. Representative Donnie Lambert, a Republican out of Forsyth County, said, quote, "Sometimes this is a very stressful job. Every once in a while, we need a good laugh. We need something lighthearted, and that's part of the reason I'm bringing forth these 2 bills. This is a kind of feel-good bill." Well, the backstory, Lambert said a 4th grade classroom visit inspired the push for these 2 bills. When presented with North Carolina's 62 official state symbols, one student pointed out that there is no state star, and thus the idea for the Moravian star bill was born. He said, quote, "We'll do a cookie bill and we'll do a star bill, and we'll see if we can get it through, and we might have a good laugh and a good cookie." Lambert explained that the Moravian cookie is a treat that originates out of the Winston-Salem area of North Carolina. It is especially popular around the holiday season and is a seasonal favorite not only across North Carolina, but across the United States, as well as the Moravian star, which is on porches here in the state and in the nation. Always great to pass along some lighthearted news. We'll keep an eye on these 2 pieces of legislation. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. As all eyes continue on the western half of our state in regards to Hurricane Helene recovery and relief, there is still a lot of discussion going on about storms that affected our state back in 2016 and 2018. To get an additional update this morning on the Cooper Accountability Act surrounding NCORR, the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, Brianna Kraemer, CarolinaJournal.com, joins us this morning on the News Hour. Brianna, thanks for the time. We introduced our listeners to this legislation last week, and it moved through a House committee earlier in the week. What are the details that you're tracking this morning?
Yes, that's right. So this act has passed the Judiciary One Committee. They were discussing this on Tuesday afternoon, and it's now going to go through several more committees before it heads to the floor for a vote. But this is called the Cooper Accountability Act, and that stands for closing out operations and providing emergency relief to the people of Eastern North Carolina who were victims of Hurricanes Florence and Matthew. So NCORR has obviously been struggling for a very long time to close out operations, to finish rebuilding homes and providing people with what they pledged they would provide as a disaster relief agency. That's what they were, developed under Governor Roy Cooper to do, was to come in and help the people of Eastern North Carolina. And yet they've struggled, mismanaged money, and haven't been able to really complete all the projects that they said they would. And so there are still people in temporary housing. There are still people waiting for their homes to get rebuilt. And so this bill is trying to push this forward and get this to an end, because state legislators are tired of having to kind of babysit NCORR at this point, and they want to be done with it and move on to Western North Carolina completely and get this out of sight. And so this bill allocates $217 million from the State Emergency Response and Disaster Relief Fund to NCORR to complete their outstanding tasks, their outstanding home recovery projects from these two hurricanes. And so it's passed the committee, and they're just trying to include in this bill a lot of accountability measures, stricter oversight to ensure that NCORR comes to an end, because that's what they really want to do, is wind down its operations and move on from it.
I hear you say $217 million additional. This is probably the third or fourth time that we've talked about dollar figures in the hundreds of millions of dollars being allocated to this agency. The question for you this morning, Brianna, is that 217 truly going to be enough with the checkered past of this agency and them constantly coming back to the General Assembly with their hands open for more money?
That's a very important question, I think, that a lot of people are asking. But it sounded like during the committee meeting that legislators were optimistic. Now, of course, that's been the case in the past, and that hasn't resulted in much. But Representative Brendan Jones, he's kind of been on top of this, following along, tracking NCORR and trying to push this thing forward. And so during the committee meeting, he said that Governor Josh Stein has pledged that the $217 million will be enough to complete all remaining recovery projects. So he's apparently working and discussing things with Governor Stein, and Stein has guaranteed that that is enough to finish the project.
We look at Representative Brandon Jones, and folks that have listened to our coverage of NCORR, maybe been reading or listening on their own, they are probably familiar with that representative. Brianna, he represents Columbus County, one of those counties that was very hard hit by both Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. So I guess for him, it's accurate to say, this is personal. These are his constituents, his neighbors that we're talking about this morning that have been waiting 8+ years for relief from the state.
Yeah, that's right. It's hard when you really think about how long it's been for these people. And since then, obviously, we've had more natural disasters. And, it's hard to keep looking back so far in the past to try to keep up with things that should have been done long ago. And when you look to other states like South Carolina that have moved on and have been able to, successfully complete their recovery operations, it definitely is frustrating, especially for these lawmakers who have been tracking it all along. But Jones has said that they want to hold them accountable, and they have safeguards in place in this legislation to kind of prevent further mismanagement, more delays. So they're going to require auditing, constant monitoring of the measures, and NCORR will be required to track and report on their expenditures and other financial details, as well as providing real-time updates to the legislature to guarantee transparency. And then they also will require the state auditor to conduct comprehensive financial and performance audits of NCORR's activities related to disaster recovery. So there's a lot in this bill that also deals with accountability to make sure that things get done once and for all. And what was really interesting from Jones is to hear that it sounds like there's a shift from last year under the Cooper administration or prior years, how the state legislature worked with the executive branch and Governor Roy Cooper, and now how they're working with Stein. Because Jones explained that legislators feel good about Stein and his staff, and he's put some pretty good staff in place, is what really Jones was saying, and that they look forward to working with them to hopefully bring things to an end for NCORR. So definitely a shift in the mood between Roy Cooper and now Josh Stein leading the governor's office.
We'll continue the conversation with Brianna Kraemer coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Don't forget, you can take the show on demand on your own time by downloading the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast wherever you get your shows. Download and subscribe now and listen to the show on demand on your own time. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Continuing to track details out of a busy legislature in Raleigh this morning, the North Carolina Senate passed a bill along party lines earlier this week that aims to crack down on state officials who may not be complying with federal immigration policies enacted by the new Trump administration. Sponsored by Senate Leader Phil Berger, the Republican out of Rockingham County, the North Carolina Border Protection Act, aka SB 153, passed in a 28-15 vote. It would ensure that state law enforcement officials are cooperating with federal immigration laws and that residents are protected from sanctuary city policies. The General Assembly passed legislation at the end of last year that mandated all sheriffs cooperate with Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, ICE. This is after a small group of left-leaning counties chose not to honor federal detainers coming from ICE. Under the latest proposal, local governments and universities that fail to comply with state immigration laws will face penalties as well. A press release from Phil Berger's office reads as follows, saying, quote, "While sanctuary city policies are already prohibited in this state, municipalities across the state continue to defy state law. To hold them accountable, any county or municipality that creates sanctuary cities will have its local immunity waived, therefore allowing citizens harmed by illegal immigrants to sue them. One of the central elements of the bills is increased cooperation between state agencies and ICE. Under the proposed law, several state law enforcement agencies, including the Department of Public Safety, Department of Adult Corrections, the State Highway Patrol, and the State Bureau of Investigation, will be required to enter into a formal agreement with ICE. Berger said on the floor, quote, "It is evident that there is a need for change when it comes to sanctuary policies in North Carolina. The legislature is stepping up to ensure our citizens and communities are safe, but unfortunately, Democrats are refusing to address the very real threat illegal immigration poses to our state." That has now fully made its way through the North Carolina Senate. It will follow the process as most other pieces of legislation that we discussed. It will make its way to the House, where they will decide whether they want to vote or not in favor of it. Republicans do have a majority in the House, and after all that is said and done, if it passes there, it will make its way to Governor Josh Stein's desk, where he will have a choice whether to veto or sign the legislation into law. We'll keep an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Continuing our discussion this morning with Brianna Kraemer from CarolinaJournal.com about the Cooper Accountability Act. Brianna, before the break, we were talking about the relationship between Governor Josh Stein and the Republican-led General Assembly. Well, let me ask you a little bit more about that. Do you think this is the case of maybe an early marriage yet, Brianna, where the issues haven't fully unfolded? We haven't been through a budget session with this legislature and Governor Stein. You think maybe this is some rose-colored glasses at the beginning, or you follow the state legislature very closely? Is this something that maybe persists throughout his term as governor, which, as you noted, would be a drastic change from Governor Cooper and the Republican-led GA of the past?
Well, that could be the case. Obviously, things are just getting started. We're 3 months into the year, and everybody's kind of getting situated in their new positions within the state government. So that could be the case. And as time goes on, relationships will ebb and flow, of course, and we'll see how the GA will work with the governor's office. But for now, they do remain optimistic. And I think that it sounds like there could be a better working environment with Stein and his staff than previously under Cooper.
I've got a question from you from a political standpoint. As we watch this, and as you noted, and as I mentioned at the top of the interview, these storms were 2016 and 2018. September of last year, Western North Carolina saw the worst hurricane in the record books in regards to the damage and destruction. Do you think from an optics standpoint, it's important to not only get these people back in their homes, but to restore some level of faith and trust within the state government that they're capable of handling something like this, as we're going to be dealing with Helene, probably in some cases, Brianna, a decade from now, we'll still be talking about relief because so many areas were so hardly hit?
Absolutely. But I do think that the trust has been fractured because we've seen several examples now, from these hurricanes almost a decade ago now, where they're still trying to finish these projects. And that's really not a good look on the state from any angle. And so the optics there are pretty bad. And then you go on to Hurricane Helene now, and they do have a lot riding on how they are going to continue to push disaster recovery for Hurricane Helene in Western North Carolina. And so far, they've passed several different bills in the General Assembly, and they're actually, it looks like, possibly finishing up their next one sometime in the next few days. But, it has been a slow start, and at least at the end of 2024, people were struggling, and we saw all kinds of viral videos about FEMA not being there and just, our leaders not really being present to help the people as, the weather was changing and people were just struggling. But I think right now the optics are definitely getting better out in Western North Carolina, but definitely something to look back on from Hurricane Matthew and Florence. And it's definitely, I think, a pressure point and they have a lot riding on this. So it's definitely something that our state legislators are focused on. That is their number one priority for this session. They've said that repeatedly. So I think they're going to be working extra diligently to get this taken care of better than in the past.
And I guess it would be important to bring up that we've heard the discussion on the national level coming out of the Trump administration about potentially retooling FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and Brianna putting a lot of the onus on states through block grant programs to handle essentially almost all aspects of relief. So legislators in the General Assembly, if something like that is to come down from Washington, D.C., they're going to have to make sure they're capable of dealing with it.
Yeah, so that's a positive and maybe a negative if our state leaders don't know how to take on that responsibility. And that's something, actually, I recently spoke with Senator Phil Berger. He's the president of the Senate, and he was very in favor of the block grant idea and kind of allowing the state to have more of a responsibility in distributing those funds versus relying on FEMA, because really it just creates a whole lot of bureaucracy and unneeded regulatory burdens that you have to jump through a lot of different loopholes. And so if they're able to get rid of that, I think that would be helpful, but it puts a lot more responsibility on state leaders.
Brianna, this is going to be something that we're tracking over the next couple of weeks and months as we keep an eye on the General Assembly and their long session. Where can folks go and read more details on the Cooper Act this morning?
Yes, we will be tracking it all. You can go to carolinajournal.com to read the latest.
Brianna Kraemer joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour.